So my name is Ben Hoffer, and I am the chairperson of the Synagogue Leadership Council of Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West and co-president of Congregation Israel of Springfield. I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's Synagogue Leadership Seminar titled Synagogue Trends and the COVID Crisis, Envisioning a Jewish Future. Before I introduce our special guest, I'd like to put this seminar into a broader context for you. Our federation is the largest Jewish philanthropy in New Jersey, encompassing Essex, Morris, Union, Sussex, and northern Somerset County. Our mission is to care for those in need, build Jewish community, and save lives here, in Israel, and in 70 countries around the globe. All of the programs like this one that we run directly, in addition to the allocations we make to our 23 partner agencies, are made possible through funds raised by the UJA annual campaign. During the pandemic, Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, together with our community foundation, has responded with over $7 million in emergency grants above and beyond our normal allocations. Until December 31st, every new or increased donation will be matched at 50% to help us replenish these funds and continue to respond to our community's COVID relief needs. Tonight's seminar is an example of Federation's commitment to partnering with synagogues to create a vibrant Jewish life in our community. Through the guidance of the Synagogue Leadership Council, we work to strengthen local synagogues and pursue our shared goals. Our next exciting event for the synagogue community will be on December 2nd. It's a virtual Hanukkah cooking demo featuring award-winning chef Michael Solomonov of Zahav Restaurant in Philadelphia. This event is being provided by Federation to area congregations as a gift of appreciation for their critical role in our community. Details are available through your synagogue, or you can reach out to Sarah Siegel, Federation's extraordinary Director of Synagogue Initiatives. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for tonight, Dr. Stephen Windmuller. Dr. Windmuller is Professor Emeritus of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, where he served as Dean and Director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. In the interest of time, I will now repeat our scholar's full bio as it was included in the preliminary materials. Sarah Siegel will assist Dr. Windmuller tonight by coordinating your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please send a private message to Sarah in the chat. At the conclusion of the presentation, she will call on each of you to ask your question as time allows. Lastly, at the conclusion of tonight's program, you will receive a brief online survey. We ask you please take 3 minutes to complete this short evaluation. Your feedback is critical to our future planning. And now I turn it over to Dr. Windmuller.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much, Ben, for hosting this gathering of synagogue leadership from Metro West. I want to express my appreciation to Sarah Siegel as well for her support and leadership in moving this initiative forward. And also to Shay Rudnoy for her assistance this evening in helping us to present the formal part of this program. So we will take about 20 minutes to quickly introduce some core material. And then indeed, as Ben has indicated, we would welcome your comments and questions as we move forward. I want to begin by a conversation which is basically where we all have left off, which is the 2020 election. Because in some measure, this has been an extraordinary year, and certainly this election has been a particular and significant moment in the American political story. But we have gone through a period of 9 months in which we have seen our society in many ways fundamentally change and shift. Those shifts have been about racial issues, about economic challenges, certainly about the medical and health welfare of our country, and certainly as well about the future of the American story of American democracy. But for Jews in particular, the challenges before us include the external threats that we are witnessing, the rise in hate crimes, in anti-Semitism, and in conspiracy theories, all of which adds to the tension and concerns on the part of our constituencies, members of our congregations, who certainly are deeply and challenged by and concerned with this rising tide of the politics of hate. But at that same moment, we are experiencing this extraordinary virtual community, what we are even witnessing at this very moment. And the rise of the virtual Jewish experience has been phenomenal. It is the storyline of this pandemic. The economic pieces that we are also experiencing as part of our synagogues, agencies, schools, and other institutions in Jewish life must be seen as significant. Already, over 30,000 Jewish professionals have been displaced from their jobs. I recently wrote about the mergers of a number of synagogues within our various movements and denominations. And indeed, we are likely to see the further displacement and even loss of some of our synagogue programs, and indeed some of the closures of synagogues going forward. The challenge here is, how do we maintain donor support for sustaining and embracing the cause of synagogues and their well-being? And while we know from Gallup that voluntarism is down amongst Americans in this pandemic, we are aware that giving has the possibilities of actually expanding as donors appreciate and value the concerns of helping fellow citizens, fellow Jews, emerge from where we are. Part of this crisis is as much about the great divide that we see, both inside our Jewish community, but across this country, as the virus itself has played out in terms of how people understand the response of science and medicine and the role of government in managing and handling this pandemic. Is there a return to community and religious revivalism? Some believe that that is happening and is a very real possibility. In fact, in two polls, one by Pew and one by Gallup, we have seen a sense of return, as 24% believe, as expressed in Pew, that there is in fact a growing response to faith and to faith communities in this moment. And Gallup reports a similar finding with its 19% indicator of showing a connection with and a strengthening of communities of faith. Indeed, moving beyond this moment, we need to remind ourselves that in the story of the United States and its history, the 1918 pandemic, the 1930s and the Great Depression, and the 1968 implosion in terms of the death of Martin Luther King, the riots that were part of that moment in time, all remind us that this moment, 2020, has all of these configurations all in one moment. And therefore, this is an extraordinary and disruptive piece to the American story that we need to fully embrace and understand because of its impact on our fellow congregants, our communities, and our synagogues. Some are describing what we are seeing as a generational pandemic, meaning young people who experienced the 2008 economic recession and now are experiencing this pandemic are living through a period which will redefine how they think about their lives and their generation. What we see in the generational pandemic is very similar to what we saw in the 1930s, as our grandparents and even great-grandparents in some cases came out of the experience of the recession and the depression, fully embracing a particular idea about life and culture, community, and connectivity. We are experiencing as well a shifting economy, and that certainly is being played out daily as we see businesses going out of their status and other industries and businesses retooling and reorganizing as they move forward. But the core ingredient in all of this is trust. Trust in core institutions, whether that be the synagogue or our communities, or whether it be the federal government and the institutions of political practice and behavior. That is in many ways a value added that we need to watch and understand, because we as Jews have understood that when people lose confidence and trust in the institutions of a society, that is problematic for minorities in particular, and historically for Jews. The American street is a key point of evidence of where some of these tensions exist. 26 million Americans took to the street this summer, more than at any moment in American history, to reflect on the questions of racial injustice and to express concerns about the economy and our state of this nation. And indeed, the election itself was a staging ground for more Americans participated politically in November of this year than at any other prior election, as more than 151 million Americans cast ballots in support or in opposition to their candidates and to their causes. The Jewish story is very specific and is profoundly important. Indeed, we have seen in this moment some new connectivities and relationships, and indeed Jewish learning. The relational piece here is significant. What we saw between March and July of this year was an extraordinary experiment as synagogues and institutions began to reach out individually to their members in this personalized form of connecting. How are you doing? Is there anything we at the synagogue can do to help you? Are there needs that you and your family have that align with the goals and objectives of our community and our synagogues? Indeed, these relational connections were profound, and they are being reported back by Brandeis and other studies as to how important people felt by being personally connected to and reached on the part of these individualized phone calls and personal expressions. But as I've noted earlier, we also are seeing the redefining of what community may mean, both in terms of the institutions and their survivability, whether some will close, whether others will be downsized, and whether we are likely to see mergers of congregations moving forward. This has been the single largest virtual Jewish experiment in history. And virtual Judaism is, in a sense, the storyline of much that has happened. As this technology has brought people to Passover, it has brought them to opportunities on the high holidays to connect with one another, and it has allowed us to teach and experience Judaism in ways that we have never envisioned before. Will we return to a kind of institutional form of Jewish life? Absolutely. But the virtual experience will continue well beyond this moment. We have moved to some degree from March till now in November from a kind of individualistic culture of bowling alone, if you wish, to a more collaborative form that we haven't seen in decades. Whether this will survive and grow and be manifest in other ways of expanding upon collaborative models of community building, that will be the question before us. We are, in a sense, creating a 21st century Jewish institutional response here. In part, it will be virtual. In other ways, it may be informative and reactive to everything we are experiencing now, whether it's relational Judaism or these various forms of virtual expression. But it will be a different modality coming out of the pandemic than we have known before. But just as we were going into this pandemic, and now as we begin to hope for the final phases in a period in which vaccines are likely to be available to us, we are also experiencing a huge amount of anti-Semitism, both through the pandemic, but certainly around all other kinds of issues affecting Jewish life here in Europe and in Israel. The new anti-Semitism is very much tied to the disruptive effects of this pandemic on many people's lives. 1/4 of Americans report that they are living from paycheck to paycheck. 40% of Americans are informing us that their lifestyles will be fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic, as they move their work experience from the workplace home. And we will see a huge shift in the economic imprint of this moment as we move forward. I have argued that this has been the greatest moment of Jewish learning we have ever known in terms of volume. The number of participants at Passover reported by Brandeis University studies, the number of Jews who are connected now virtually by the various opportunities that have been made available by our synagogue, schools, centers, and other institutions. This has also been the centerpiece of foundations and their role in helping to work and build the new Jewish economy, as they have intersected with our federations, with the federal government, to jointly merge the resources that have and were available this summer in creating a very different storyline in terms of the roles that these institutions can and are playing. But there is an emotional cost, just as there is a financial one. We have learned not only from the Brandeis study, but from other reports of the deep sense of isolation, loneliness, and the imprint of all of that on the lives of many of our seniors, of our very young, and of our singles, who have all, in a sense, felt the loss of this sense of community and identity and personal connection. These then are some of the core outcomes that I think are part of this moment in time. Indeed, we are at a different stage in terms of our recovery. We are beginning to see the various outcomes essential for when we move beyond this moment. Part of that we've described, and part we will describe moving forward. We have seen a changing role of government. Only 3 times in American Jewish history have we seen government intervene with and on behalf of Jewish institutional interests. The first time was the 1930s and the serious depression of that period. The second time involved Soviet Jewry and the efforts to assist Soviet Jews in resettlement. And the third was indeed dealing with the security concerns of our synagogues and institutions as government became an important ally in assisting institutions in protecting and defending their physical plants and staff and professionals. And here again, at this moment, we are seeing the intervention of government this past summer in its assessment and assistance with loans and grants in support of maintaining the viability of the nonprofit sector along with other sectors of the American economy. Indeed, I think that we are drawing upon all of the past experiences we have seen with this moment in time. It has taught every synagogue and every synagogue administrator the importance of strategic planning, the value of having resources and funds protected for such moments in time. It is a reminder of the essential value of having adequate support mechanisms in place to assist our institutions financially and structurally when we come to these kinds of experiences. But certainly our concerns go beyond the financial. They deal with the psychological, emotional, and physical well-being of our community. And that remains to be fully experienced and understood as we continue to monitor the welfare of many in our community. We are also living with the reality that not all of us necessarily accept science and government and public policy as necessarily the behaviors ideal and essential for what we want. Some have called this hygienic fascism. That is, that government is imposing certain expectations, rules, and behaviors. And some individuals and some organizations indeed are pushing back against that. We need to understand the differences here about how best for individuals and institutions to function in this new environment in which the state has certain interests and which individuals and institutions may have conflicting and challenging interests. But we need to remind ourselves that American Jews are amongst the oldest age cohort in this country. We have a higher percentage of Jews 65 and over than any other white ethnic institutional group in American society. And we are also experiencing a significant out-migration from large metropolitan areas of significant parts of middle class and upper middle class individuals and families. We note this in the metropolitan New York area, in Southern California, as well as in other parts of the United States, where we are seeing this out-migration occurring even as the pandemic itself has become the central story. Indeed, in the end, the new American normal will be a collective of all that we are seeing and much that we do not yet know in terms of what the effects of this moment in time will have on the psyche, the financial, and the cultural imprint of Americans and American society moving forward. In many ways, I think we will want to memorialize this moment. It is one of those hinge experiences in our lifetime, and we will want to recall it as well as to understand its implications for both our institutions, our synagogues, and our personal lives. But there are immediate and long-term realities. The immediate ones we are beginning to read and understand rather clearly, and that incorporates certainly the principles associated with virtual learning and living, the value of personal connections and relationships, and the importance of having financial backup resources when we experience these kinds of moments. We believe, based on the studies we have available to us from various Christian sources, that 1 out of every 3 churches in America will disappear over the next 5 years. We believe as well that a significant piece of the religious establishment will be going through huge changes, as both in Christianity and now certainly in Judaism, we are likely to see the significant reorganizing of our national denominational systems and structures. That story is still evolving, but as those of you who are part of United Synagogue can well attest, 2 weeks ago, your Metropolitan New York Regional Office hosted a major conference on mergers and on collaborative models of engagement, signaling to all of us a pattern that we are likely to see across the spectrum of synagogues going forward. Indeed, a lot of the data in this particular slide, which references points we have raised earlier, reminds us of the importance of how these institutions evolved and were constructed. And indeed, amongst the major issues that I think will be and are being addressed by synagogues is the third item from the bottom, membership, dues, and affiliation. Because the major questions before us is, how do we sustain our memberships? How do we determine ways in which we can fund synagogues and allied institutions in different modalities than we've currently used and have experienced? This is also a moment about rethinking the entire communal system. And earlier today, I had the opportunity to speak with the leadership of the Metro West Federation about some of those specific questions. And moving beyond this moment, we will be rewriting and reframing a 21st century Judaism that will, in my mind, fundamentally look different and operate differently than the structures and systems we inherited as part of our denominations and affiliations and organizing from the 20th century moving forward. So in a sense, I think as we close this out, we are looking at a number of challenges. We are living in an age that we will all agree is particularly and profoundly chaotic in terms of its politics, its issues associated with race and culture, and its concerns with regard to managing this pandemic. But we are now in this country amongst the 4th and 5th generation of American Jews, and that is profoundly important in terms of the choices that new generations of Jews will and are making about affiliation and participation, and the effect of the rise of boutique organizations that began to emerge in the period of the 1980s and forward. We are witness to 500 literally new expressions of Jewish life, living, and learning as a result of that explosion and revolution. These boutique institutions are in your community and across the country. They reflect different ways by which younger Jews are affiliating and participating. How we as legacy institutions engage with these newer and different forms of organizing will be part of the story moving forward. Indeed, is this the end of peoplehood or of community, or is this merely a reshaping of what Jewish peoplehood will look like? How will diaspora-Israel relationships emerge? And in what ways will we see community redefine itself? I think we're living in also one of the significant moments in Jewish history, the emergence and growth of American Jewish Orthodoxy is significant. It will play a profoundly important role moving forward in Jewish life. And we need to come to a kind of better understanding of the relationships amongst Jews, between Jews, as we experience and welcome this growth. We are living, as I suggest, in a cusp between two models: the legacy movements of the 19th century that created our denominations and our synagogue world and our federated system, and the boutique institutions that have come into being over the past 30 to 50 years that have created an alternative voice in the Jewish experience. So we are indeed a divided community. At the same moment, we have the opportunity to create new forms of community. I look forward to your questions as we move forward here, and thank you for your attention to this introductory presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Windmuller. That was really, really a wonderful overview. And good evening to everyone. If you joined us late, my name is Sarah Siegel. I know many of you. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. We are going to turn to questions shortly. And before you ask your question, if you could please, for one, show your camera and unmute yourself. And please introduce yourself by name. Let us know what synagogue you're from and what town your synagogue is in. And I think David Ehrenfried, I know you posed a question in the chat, but maybe you can just raise it verbally for our speaker, and we can start there.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Windmuller. Appreciate your comments. I have a question, sort of not necessarily directly related to the impact of COVID on synagogues, but more generally perhaps. But it's in the chat, so you can read it, but I'll read it. So it appears that there's now a sizable group of Jews who identify themselves closely with the political far right wing. And many identify with an evolving, I guess I call it a cultural ecology that includes the far right wing of the Republican Party, right wing media like Breitbart and Town Hall, and organizations like the American Rifle Association, Proud Boys, and so forth. And they also question facts underlying the realities of COVID, the efficacy of wearing masks, and social distancing, and even the safety of vaccines. Could you comment on, I guess these are observations of mine. I don't know whether people would agree with me or not, but it's concerning because of the moral and ethical implications and the differences that that many of us share with, with the Jews that identify, with the political right wing in our country.
Thank you, David, for your question. It really brings me to another project I'm working on. I'm producing a book, Donald Trump's Impact on American Jews. And that book will come out next summer, published by the University of Southern California. And it will look at some of these questions from a political perspective. And it will be involving writers who are Republican and Democrat, independent, Israeli and American, from all different sort of worlds. One of the outcomes of the American Jewish experience, and the pandemic has accelerated that, is the redefining of the American Jew, meaning that we are many different voices, political voices for sure, religious and cultural ones to be exact. And as part of that, it creates the question, is this a community? Are we multiple communities? Do we share certain core values any longer? So that is part of the challenge, I think, that faces Jewish life moving forward. No doubt there are Jews, as you have suggested, whose political viewpoints differ widely with other Jews. And that creates a much harder framework by which we define the commonalities and the centrality of where Judaism may or may not fit into this story. I think one of the steps that's required as we come forward here is conversations with Jews that we normally don't include or speak with in our lives. And that will be a difficult task, but it will be an essential one to learn about one another, why we hold particular views, and what is important to us as Americans and as Jews. I'm not sure either side will win allies or friends to their cause, but what is as critical is at least opening doors of conversation, because the silence we have created at times and the distrust that we have established is neither healthy for our institutions, and certainly is not healthy for a rather robust and an essential dialogue that Americans need to have with one another. And the Jewish community can model that, frankly, and that's a piece I would sort of throw out there as one way to explore these huge differences amongst us.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Robert Berger, please remind us where you're from and what town you're in as well.
Robert Berger. I'm a member of B'nai Shalom in West Orange. I actually live in Livingston, so I have a 15-minute commute to Synagogue. And I've been involved in strategic planning both for my synagogue, other synagogues, and other Jewish institutions. So I want to dig down a little more about the virtual experience that Jewish life undertook during COVID, and broaden it to the fact that in the economy, we've seen an acceleration of the adoption of all kinds of virtual activities for work, for shopping, and that what I want to ask in terms of the synagogue model as that new form of the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of work, the marketplace of shopping, how that might impact the synagogue model in terms of you pay to be a member, which is the way it is for most synagogues, and the fact that people today are used to picking and choosing whatever they want, wherever they want to get it from. And how do you see that playing out in this 21st century model that you kind of referenced?
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate that. I mean, I'm going to suggest here that at least three different ways of looking at this. Some of the congregations in this country took this moment to, in a sense, assert a kind of national position or national vision of how they would market themselves, so that there are synagogues that have the infrastructure and financial capacity and the ability at this point to reach audiences well beyond their catchment, well beyond their particular towns and communities. And that represents an interesting new dimension to synagogue connections and potential affiliation. The second is local synagogues that have created and are creating ways by which they engage, educate, communicate, and share worship with their constituencies. And that, of course, is a financial challenge to some of these synagogues in moving from the traditional models of worship and practice to online experiences. But we've seen some extraordinary outcomes from that over the high holidays, from Passover and other experiences, and weekly Shabbat and community expressions of that. So these vary, but they represent a model that may continue well beyond COVID, meaning that synagogues will be both offering to their members return to community, but also the availability of the virtual. The third model is that we are seeing the emergence of groups outside of the synagogue world, almost a kind of privatized Judaism frame, creating alternative expressions or ways to participate. So some of these are national, some of these are local, but they are creating a learning invitation to Jewish individuals, families, to connect with them. So we, in a sense, the marketplace has dictated and driven what we are now seeing. These three different models: the sort of large synagogue model of being able to compete widely because they have infrastructure, the smaller localized synagogues managing and will continue to manage their online learning and ultimately return to community, and hopefully also continue to make available to those individuals who are isolated for all kinds of reasons, who can still have access. And then finally, the new privatized versions, which are challenging the existing marketplace. So all of this will contribute to what we're likely to see beyond COVID in many ways.
Thank you. Could I just follow up? Are there any best practices in the second model? Because I think most of us represent local synagogues that you might be able to represent, might be able to share with us.
Well, they are still evolving, but what we have seen and what seems to be really of some value is that congregations, especially our Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative synagogues, move to create types of service delivery where they pre-taped, for example, parts of the high holiday services for broadcast, and are doing other types of innovative ways by which communities can participate. Some congregations have created a combination of the virtual and the and being directly connected with congregants. And that has worked in some very interesting ways. They're drive-by virtual learning experiences. So you literally take your kids and you go to a particular either family or a member of the congregation's household, or you go to the congregational facility itself, and there's a from your car learning experience, creatively introduced and done as a way of sort of living with our new cultural and physical realities. So what is suggested here is that institutions are trying to figure out all the different ways that learning can take place, whether virtual or in real time, accepting the guidelines required by our state and federal officials in concert with those. I can refer you to some articles which actually deal with specific examples of this sort of crossbreeding of the virtual with the real world, and happy to share that with Sarah, who can in turn share that with you. So hopefully that will be of help to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eileen Weiss from Oheb Shalom. Would you like to ask your question about relational Judaism there?
Sure, thank you. I'd like to know a little bit more about relational Judaism, and particularly with the focus on intimacy. How do you view that changing or evolving the way we pray, where someone's up front leading and sort of everybody is more watching as opposed to participating in that more intimate way? And do you see any trends in that may be emerging?
Well, first I would refer you to Ron Wolfson's work on relational Judaism. Ron has a faculty member at the American Jewish University, and his work on really the personal relationship modality of Judaism and ways by which congregations can make the sort of focus on user-friendly kinds of connections between congregant and leader, congregant and congregant, and his work, which has been extensive, is really the first stop. The second is, I think, the increased focus on creating ways by which congregants can be participatory. That is, whether it's in the form of worship, where they are invited to unmute and participate, or whether it's in the form of study, where they're given challenging questions online or visual and asked to respond. So how much do you know about the book of Genesis? And what are some of the core storylines that are associated with it? In a sense, thereby creating an interactive learning opportunity online, where either the rabbi or teacher presents materials and challenges his community, in a sense, with the opportunity for an interactive learning experience. And a third expression or possibility here involves the return to Chavarot. I mean, lots of congregations are talking about the value that they have historically had with Chavurah, and now Chavurah becomes particularly important as groups of families sharing time together virtually can do projects, study together, celebrate holidays together, or create some other aspects of community that are essential for both seniors and younger family members. So all of this is part of really not just reinventing what we have done in the past, but figuring out new ways to sort of employ the technologies that now are available to us.
Okay, does that answer your question, Eileen? Great. Okay. I was just wondering, Dr. Windmuller, have you noticed any major differences across the country in terms of synagogue changes that are going on, whether it's mergers or more unusual innovations happening in one part of the country versus the other?
Well, I think it's actually not so much a geographical story of what is happening, but it is really about particular locales or particular circumstances. So, I mean, we are reporting on mergers in Brooklyn, in Baltimore. We have mergers in the metropolitan New York area. We have mergers here in Southern California that are in play. Conversations in play between and among synagogues about shared opportunities to do things together. So do you do senior adult programming in synagogues collectively? As High Village is a case study of that. High Village involves two synagogues here in Los Angeles that received an outside grant to develop and grow their work in senior adult services and programming. And other congregations are now emulating that around the country as they seek to look at the fact that the Jewish community is older and senior services are critical, and keeping seniors in place, keeping them connected to their respective synagogues, and yet allowing them to share and learn collaboratively or jointly with others is a profoundly healthy and wonderful experience. We are seeing some interesting initiatives on the part of institutions that are small and without buildings. That is, there, as we know, there are a number of synagogues that have really made the choice not to go with, this goes back over certainly years, of not to go with buildings, and how this moment in a sense has given them a bit more of a creative edge in being able to do things without the expense of still maintaining buildings and investing and putting all of their resources into programmatic initiatives, whether for their students or for young families or for seniors, so that has been particularly highlighted by their having more financial capacity at a point when others are still trying to sustain buildings. There's a huge conversation taking place around the issue of membership, alternative models of membership, ways to raise funds in addition to membership, and developing endowments for synagogues as a way to learn from this moment and to deal with this moment, to give synagogues financial cushion so that in a future moment such as this, synagogues and other institutions will be in a better financial position to manage salaries and programming and institutional resources moving forward. So we have a huge amount of transition happening in congregational life today. And it varies by, as I suggest, more by the institution and its health, financial and otherwise, than it does by region of the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, and I must add, we've seen a tremendous amount of collaboration going on in Greater Metro West in the past few months. We've always been very collaborative, but there's certainly been a big increase in collaborative projects, events between Federation and synagogues, and definitely among synagogues and each other. Amy Balloon, would you like to pose your question?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. I am Amy Balloon. I'm the Chief Community Engagement Officer at Federation, and it is always exciting to see all of the great things that we are doing with our synagogues and the ways in which our synagogues are participating in our federated community. So thank you for being with us tonight. My question is actually not about friends in the United States per se, but more about if Dr. Windmuller, if you're seeing any changes in American Jews' perceptions of Israel and of Israeli society based upon their handling of the crisis and kind of the up and down experience. I think at the beginning, at least in my household, there was this sense that Israel had gotten it right and that there was tremendous pride in the technological advances that were coming out of Israel. And that brought sort of the usual sense of pride that I feel in all great things that come and happen in and around the state of Israel. And then things kind of, the bottom fell out from under them, I think a little quicker than even here perhaps, or at least than what I was expecting. And so I'm wondering if there's any data or information about opinions and feelings about Israel from American Jews.
I don't believe I've seen any new data about American Jewish attitudes toward Israel during this period, although what you cited are really some important realities. Israel was early on in doing very well in managing the crisis. It did and is producing some extraordinary medical outcomes in connection with treatment and the management of COVID. And it is already very much in line for beginning to do far earlier than some societies, some advanced testing of vaccines with some constituencies. It also faced some challenges, as we know, and those challenges were not too dissimilar to what we've seen elsewhere, which is, as I suggested in the slide presentation, that there are different perspectives and beliefs about science, the role of rules associated with the managing of this pandemic. And the Israelis, as with here in the United States, there have been these various challenges to what is, how do you balance, in a sense, the interests of your special communities and of your general population. But I don't have any data to suggest, that there have been any new insights about how American Jews view Israel, other than to tell you that on every poll and study we have about the 2020 election, that Israel played a minor role for most American Jews in this election. It did not mean that Jews were not concerned about Israel, but it was not a high profile item for many Jewish voters. For certainly what I guess I call identity politics voters who vote what they perceive to be core self-interests, whether it's fighting anti-Semitism, dealing with Israeli security, dealing with American national security, that for those voters, Israel certainly was a high profile consideration. But for the studies that we've seen, over 70% of American Jews across the board in every study said Israel was not a priority issue this time around.
Thank you. Jessica DeConnick from B'nai Keshet, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Windmuller. I wanted to come back to membership. Can you give us some examples of alternate strategies to membership for raising money that places are trying and their relative success?
Okay, well, we are still in the experimental stages with some of these models, but they are in play. For example, some congregations have moved to give and get. In other words, give what you can, but bring us new members, bring us folks who might join with you, friends of yours who are not synagogue affiliated and who are maybe looking to become part of community. The second model is a conversation with your major historic donors to help underwrite and to grow their role in helping to assist families in need and to help cushion some of the costs associated with managing during this period, but overall the welfare of the synagogue. A third dimension has been to develop alternative income streams to the basic membership model. And of course, this is a much more complicated question. Some of this may involve an annual event. It can involve a variety of different kinds of giving circles or giving arrangements. But the goal here is to take some of the burden off of the individual family unit and to focus more attention on broadening the ways by which individuals can support the congregational life. Now, those congregations that have alternative income streams, some of those have been drastically hurt at this moment. The camping movements, for sure, have really damaged and certainly not been an asset to synagogues. Travel to Israel has sometimes been seen as a way of raising additional funds through the travel programs. Not possible at this time. A third has been cemeteries. So cemeteries continue to operate, but they also have huge expenses, and actually some of their expenses have accelerated during the pandemic as well. Other congregations have other kinds of income streams of various types, whether they operate well-aged housing facilities or whether they have other incomes from their gift shops and other sources. It varies. We have seen an effort as well to see whether or not over time synagogues can grow, and as I've talked about earlier, their endowments as a way to offset annualized giving through memberships. And certainly encouraging families who have long-standing histories with a particular congregation to become legacy donors, to create endowments, and to ensure in their estate planning that synagogues and that particular synagogue is supported. And then finally, what we've also identified is the growing effort of congregations to certainly find ways to cut some of their core costs. So that has meant in some cases, synagogues have sold off part of their buildings or have rented out their facilities or have created other income streams through the use of their facilities. So we are seeing really a kind of an entrepreneurial mindset to synagogue membership as a way of really trying to explore all the different ways that one can generate new dollars and sustain the operational expenses associated with synagogue life.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to circle back briefly to David from Or Shalom and Summit. You had a follow-up question about seniors?
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to come back, Dr. Windmiller, to some of the things that you said about seniors. Our experience has been very good in terms of the virtual services, and we see very good we see pretty good participation among seniors, middle-aged people in particular. And in fact, we get the parents often of some of our congregants attending our weekday, our daily minions, as well as our Shabbat services. But there's a concern about trying to reach the seniors that don't have the same comfort with using a computer, or maybe even just don't have a laptop or an iPad, have concerns about using their phone. And the problem at this point, of course, with COVID is that we can't, we can't go and see them and they can't come and see us. So I don't know, maybe there's no solution to this for now until, until we have a vaccine and we can start to have some, interaction with one another. But what are you seeing going on around the country to address these kinds of concerns? I mean, are there solutions at this point?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the number of congregations, and this may also be what you all are doing as well, is to be calling on these folks every so often, as I mentioned at the outset in my presentation about the telephone trees, to congregants saying, how are you doing? Is there anything you need? Can we be of help? Can we direct you to a federation agency or social service that could provide what may be at hand or of need? So these personal connection points are particularly significant. And I say that because in my own congregation, we did, prior to the high holidays, we provided a package to every member of the congregation, and the board members actually went to the homes of our congregants delivering these packages, and obviously distance reality required, engaged with them from the outside, simply checking in on how people were doing and letting them know that we were thinking about them at this moment in time. These kinds of, just check-ins, if you wish, are particularly, I think, important because they continue to show that even if people cannot fully participate in the weekly programming of the congregation or even on Shabbat, that at least the congregation is there as a resource to help folks through this very difficult, and particularly for those seniors you just described, probably very, very isolated and feeling very much vulnerable. The more connection by personal visit, by telephone, or by even correspondence of sorts is a critical piece to keeping them part of the community.
Yeah, and we have done that kind of outreach. We have teams of people who are assigned to various congregants and do things like shopping for them and so forth.
Yes, yeah, beautiful. And I didn't discuss that, but the shopping model is particularly successful in the number of congregations who've reported that they become basically lifesavers for many folks who are shut in and isolated, and by providing either food or medicines or the personal touch of calling, all of that adds to the, it's a Jewish value, as we know, and it's in this case a life-saving value of importance.
I might also add that I think the Brandeis study that we sent in the link before the seminar, they talked about some of the findings around, even though we're so concerned about seniors, surprisingly, the study found that the seniors are quite resilient, and it's the younger folks that tend to experience or express more isolation and feelings of loneliness. And I've also noticed that a lot of synagogues have done more in terms of small group gatherings online around common interests, whether it's a book group or a current events discussion, or if there's some common thread. I know one synagogue that gets together a group of people who are caring for older parents, a bit of a support group to talk just about that. They were doing that before COVID, but even more so now. Any kind of common thread to connect people together seems to be, and the best way to kind of hold members to each other, because I know Ben and I have talked about this in the past, that the schmoozing time, right, is the stuff that we miss the most right now. So any excuse to find a way to schmooze with each other is great. I want to just circle back to Robert Berger from B'nai Shalom in West Orange, right? You had another question?
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Doctor, I want to circle back to the discussion on mergers and collaborations. And I have some limited firsthand experience with both of those things in synagogues and other nonprofit organizations. And two observations I have, which I'd like you to respond to, and then also indicate whether or not what we're seeing now is maybe different. The one is that the mergers are usually reactive, meaning somebody's in trouble, usually financial or with membership, and is desperate and then tries to find a home for their congregation. And that seems to be the primary mode of which how mergers come to place, and not organizations working from strength but from weakness. And the second is that a lot of the challenges in working through both mergers and collaborations is this very parochial instinct about each person's synagogue, the role of their rabbi, the role of their building. And are you seeing some of those things still, or are there changes taking place because of the new realities? I just like your general comments about that, but particularly in terms of whether you're seeing changes.
Robert, I think you're correct. And even in this moment, when a merger does happen, you usually have one institution that is in more financial distress than the other. It's not generally what we have seen to date, two institutions with equal sort of shared dilemmas or shared problems, but rather one more than the other. But right now, what we are seeing as well are congregations that are trying to preempt what they think down the road will be more serious financial challenges, looking to do collaborative programming, some measure of stepping ahead of the curve that they see coming. The issue you raised secondly, which is really profoundly significant, because look, we have a huge number of synagogues which have long legacy histories. Many of our congregations, certainly in New Jersey, because of the sort of character of your part of the American Jewish story, is that these are synagogues that have been around for 70, 80 more years, and thereby have deep loyalties among congregants to their rabbis, amongst members to one another, and giving up that sense of their distinctive identities is very hard, is profoundly difficult. And that can be one of the challenges of creating any kind of change of the status quo, of creating mergers. So it sometimes requires an outside resource to tell the story to the bottom line story. Folks, there isn't a future here for you without some kind of accommodation to working with, being part of another institution nearby, and in that context, talking about how do you preserve at least portions or pieces of your past story. In Chicago, for example, there were congregations that have merged where there's a distinctive effort to keep in, and as part of the new engagement of these two congregations, to keep alive the storyline of the smaller congregation by making sure that some of its historic markers are in display in the building of the congregation that has absorbed them, has brought them in, and that their story is not left out when talking about the history of the congregations. It's of both of their histories and not just of the one. And the distinctive either minhag or traditions of that particular community are constantly celebrated and shared. But this is all extraordinarily difficult because you are basically undoing history. And that is why, Robert, as you point out correctly, you often see great resistance even as the handwriting appears on the wall.
So my follow-up to that is, how do we get beyond that? Because my experience with mergers has been, it's usually when it's too late. The synagogue has already decayed to the point where it just needs a lifeline. And to your point about preempting those things, when there still are organizations that are viable,
yeah,
but that if they could break down some of these barriers, they could, 1 + 1 would equal 3, and not a half plus a half equals maybe 1.
Yes. I mean, there are some conversations happening right now that I'm aware of between and among congregations that are not in trouble, that are not at that desperate moment. And the healthy piece about those conversations is about, so how do we look ahead and plan ahead with our mutual interests in mind? And that requires some astute, adaptive leadership for sure. And it requires rabbis in particular and lay leaders as well, who remove the ego of place and power and authority and acknowledge that in 3 to 5 years from now, there will be some new realities. And preparing for those is actually a menschlich and appropriate good governance practice. But it requires leadership who are extraordinary in their vision and can take off those hats of my authority, my power, my community, and wear the hat of the well-being of the collective and the enterprise that can grow out of this, that can emerge from this. But those are tough. And Sarah, what we can do in the future is maybe have a conversation just about how we build and prepare leadership for these kinds of traumatic and significant transformational stories. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have one more question. Shkeki Schechner, would you like to pose your question? Tell us where you're from, of course.
Sure. I'm Paul Schechner, Congregational Hope Shalom in South Orange. And given that, so where we have hybrid services, or at least in our opinion, is here to stay, that we're not just going back to plain ordinary in-person services, and we're always going to have live stream Zoom in conjunction with in-person services. What does this mean for ritual? Does this mean we're going to say count minions differently? Does it mean, like, God forbid, we'll have shorter services because you can't stare at a screen for 5 hours on Yom Kippur? I mean, what do we see as any long-range impacts of that? And at the same time, as a follow-up question, or if you don't like that one, it's how do we use this new technology to reach out to families like kids and the rest who can't come Saturday mornings to Shabbat because they're playing soccer or this or that or traveling? How do we use the technology to get them so that we can get the unconnected to stay connected?
Great questions. I think already conversations are in play, both nationally, but more importantly in different communities, about how to make all of this work, and realizing that with the virtual piece likely to be with us well beyond COVID-19, I think a number of congregations are trying to figure out with their rabbinic leadership, what do services look like? How do we, in a sense, reframe the whole idea of a minyan and of worship, and what halachically, depending again on denomination and religious practice, what halachically is acceptable and is not acceptable. So we're going to see lots of different models. And my sense is, rather than saying there's a conservative model, a reform one, and an orthodox one, I think you're much more likely to see these break out by the style or practice or the comfortability of a congregation for going to something like that. So the ritual committees will have a lot to say about that in conjunction with the rabbinic leadership, for sure. And the idea that you raised about sort of making available religious school as a floating or movable feast with opportunities for people to come in and go out when available. So soccer competes at one place, but maybe there's downtime at another. And so having this material available, so it is already either pre-taped or created in such a way that it is so creative that kids will be interested enough to say to their parents, I'm really open to and interested in being part of this religious school experience or this day school program. So that becomes the challenge of our educators and our rabbinic leadership, to really, in a sense, we are reworking old systems with some very creative and new models of delivery. And that's what this is about. And already, if you are reading the journals, whether it's E-Jewish Philanthropy, Tablet Magazine, or any number of publications, the conversations about innovative Jewish learning and education is very much all over the place as people realize exactly this challenge of how do we take advantage of the moment, deal with the realities of our changing demographies of our communities, and work through some of these educational initiatives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been just such a stimulating conversation. It covered so many topics, and I think we could have multiple seminars on many different aspects of what we talked about today. I just want to reiterate what Ben said at the beginning, that we are so eager for everyone's feedback to us about this seminar, about future seminars. We definitely welcome your suggestions on future topics. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben shortly to just wrap up and offer our thanks to our wonderful guest speaker tonight. But in the meantime, I'm also going to just place into the chat a link to a quick Survey Monkey that we'd really appreciate everybody to just take 3 minutes to fill out a quick survey about tonight and about future seminars. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ben to wrap things up.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Windmuller. What an amazing presentation, giving us a lot to think about. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank all of our participants tonight. By participating in this program, you've demonstrated the value in our community. And hopefully this is just one example of the way we'll come together to solve our collective challenges. And by leveraging our different perspectives and experiences, we'll have a better opportunity to tackle the challenges ahead. So again, the next event that we're going to be having is December 2nd with Michael Solomonov. Please speak to Sarah regarding all the details. And thank you all for coming. Have a great night.